Like for the last couple of years, we have seen a number of new regulations being adopted by the EU.
The key question that doesn't get asked enough in that context is really what this whole discourse around digital sovereignty, what is it actually for?
Including who is it for?
Ask is what kind of digital future do we want for Europe?
I remember when I went to one of your seminars, there was something that you said that has really struck me, and you said that you're in love with infrastructure. And it's something that I felt like, oh my gosh, we are really on the same page, because I feel the same way. So I felt like I need to talk to you, and there has been so many that has been happening in this area. Like for the last couple of years, we have seen a number of new regulations being adopted by the EU. So we have the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, AI Act, Data Act, and so on. But these are laws. But we have also seen that last November, the Declaration of European Sovereignty has been adopted in Berlin. And that's a document that I think epitomizes and illustrates what are the long-term ambitions of the EU in that area. But let's unpack it, because I think that it has left many questions unanswered. So what does it really include, and what, in your view, are the key messages of this declaration?
Yeah, it's great to chat about these issues. I was in Berlin when the declaration was adopted, and it was clearly meant to signal to the world that Europe is digitally sovereign and will become even more digitally sovereign. So it was meant to send a political message. But if one looks more deeply on why that declaration was adopted and what it says in the text, I think you can spot some fault lines and tensions. And in some ways, it's a reaction to the geopolitical shifts that we've also experienced in recent days in Davos, with increased interconnectedness increasingly being perceived as increased dependencies that can get weaponized, thereby creating vulnerabilities. And I think Europe, for a long time, as you indicate, has struggled with finding a response to what some would call the digital transformation, so increasing adoption of computational digital technologies. And the go-to response so far has been regulation. And now more recently, we've seen political movements in the EU trying to steer the conversation into new directions. Maybe Europe should build alternative digital infrastructures, a Eurostack. Maybe Europe should find its own way, a European way of responding to the digital transformation. And the declaration itself, I think, is a reaction to that tries to portray a united front. But I see two main issues with it. One is that it seems to assume that Europe is digitally sovereign, and that sovereignty needs to be strengthened and can certainly be improved, but it is maybe not realistic enough about the state in which Europe finds itself in. That's one. And I think the other one that you even see with this little asterisk in the document itself concerns the question of how open or closed Europe should be. And I think that's a question you have thought a lot about, and I would like to get your input on. So the declaration insists that this is not about protectionism. Yeah. But where do you draw the line between pursuing strategic autonomy on the one hand, and on the other hand, being open to the world and not being protectionist?
I think that's a very difficult question with no simple answers, but I would say that we need to distinguish between the legitimate strategic autonomy and de facto protectionism. So the first one for me happens if you respond to evidence-based map vulnerabilities and you use least distortive measures to address those vulnerabilities. Whereas de facto protectionism, at least for me, exists where you have a strong preference, possibly embedded directly and explicitly in a specific law, that says you need to get an EU provider, but that does not respond to this evidence-based vulnerability that I have mentioned earlier. Or it also adopts discriminatory measures that are not proportionate to the problem that have been identified. So in order to avoid this all catch-up trap where we simply have, we have a vulnerability across anything or in any area, it's important to not to use it as a blanket justification, but to accept that it is a multidimensional problem, and therefore to have solutions that respond to specific dimensions of vulnerability. And of course, you could ask me, what are those dimensions? And I think it will depend, of course, on the people you talk to. But in very broad terms, for me, it would be market or economic dimension, or critical infrastructure. We can think about the Critical Entities Directive, for example, or it could be constitutional and fundamental rights dimension. So in order to then have solutions that respond to specific dimensions, we need to have like general principles for any measures that we want to adopt. And this for sure should be narrow and evidence-based, proportionate, with sunset clauses, and of course accountability. What I think is also important is that in order to have strategic autonomy, we will need more industrial policy. In the past, it was the ugly, dirty word that nobody wanted to talk about, but now it has kind of it has come to the forefront, so we are no longer shy about using it. We will need more industrial policy, but it will need to be balanced with competition policy. This is not a new topic. It has been discussed broadly by politicians, policymakers, and academics. But I think that there are some things that are a bit different. So. In the past, one of the critiques, and I'm not going now to cover all discussion, but in the past, one of the main critiques was that the negative effects of industrial policy were coming from the fact that you were picking winners. And how can you know? Because the market will be the best identifier of who is the winner. But today, the industrial policy, I think the new dimension is that given that the problems we are facing are much more complex because of global supply chains, because of geopolitical situation, this new industrial policy is really about bringing key stakeholders together. And innovation relevant for industrial policy happens where you bring together government, industry, and academia. So I think in that sense, industrial policy today is less problematic than in the past. What we also see is that procurement is the key driver of the demand. But procurement so far, so we see like initiatives at the local level, cities, and so on. Even Airbus is going to plan a big procurement contract in this January. But what is important for me in order to make this whole discussion about digital sovereignty meaningful is how to leverage demand from public authorities and companies to consumers. And I think that will be a very big challenge that we'll need to address.
Yeah, and I think what I hear you say is that once you break it down, so once you move from the very abstract notion of digital sovereignty to the concrete, what does that actually mean? Yeah. How does that turn into an actionable European digital industrial policy? All kinds of governance questions are suddenly...
Absolutely, that's what I wanted to ask you actually. Can we do what I'm talking about within the current governance structures that we have, or do we kind of need to rethink them completely?
Yeah, and to me, that was one of the main lessons out of the Eurostec seminar that you also participated in.
Yeah, super interesting, by the way.
To see that some questions that are kind of staples of European Union law suddenly get a different ring to it. So I thought about that, for example, with regard to the question of competencies. So what kind of powers does the European Union have? So far, we've mostly discussed those questions in terms of what kind of lawmaking powers does the European Union have to achieve the internal market. Now, if the idea is suddenly not just to create new law, but build new infrastructures, the question arises, who's going to fund those infrastructures? Who is going to operate them? Who's going to maintain them? And what does that mean for the relationship between the EU and its member states? I think the other area that you mentioned in your reply as well is public procurement law. So that's where the political momentum seems to be. That's also where protectionism is advanced. It's advanced as a political agenda by some actors within that conversation who basically say we should buy European. Yeah. And one interesting question that arises then is, what is European? So what makes a product European? What makes a provider European? Is a US company that is present in the European market also a European company for purposes of public procurement law?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we can have, actually many American companies have headquarters in different EU member states for tax reasons or for anything else. But answering that question will need to be said within the legal frameworks. And I think that that's going to be very complex. So what do you think? Like, what would be a European for you?
So I think it can't just be the formal criterion, I think. So it can't just be, it's a company that is established in the EU, or it's, if we talk about data law, it's a data set that is stored on a physical server within the EU. I don't think that those are the criteria that we should use to establish Europeanness for purposes of structuring a European digital policy. And when we did the Eurostack seminar, we played a lot with that concept of the stack, which of course can be conceptualized in different ways. You can think of different layers of the stack. But one question that you asked during the seminar really stayed with me, which is, how do you do that? How do you, in a way, full stack governance across a stack at scale in the particular European context with 27 member states and with that are based on and try to govern based on principles of democracy? So
I think this debate is like full of very complex questions. And as you mentioned, the stack, how we conceptualize can be different. So one example is the Eurostack, where you have specific layers, but the stack is basically, for me, something that includes different layers that can be defined differently depending on the level of granularity that you want to adopt. But what is important is that there is a strong interdependence between all those layers, and that you need all of them to form a well-functioning digital ecosystem, digital infrastructure, whatever you want to call it. Very often, those different layers require different levels of involvement at global supply chains. So building one layer can be a bit easier than the other one, but generally there are many interdependencies that have been established over a very long period of time, if we consider, for example, the semiconductors industry. So one country that came to my mind when I was thinking about which one is really good at building, that didn't have it, like, let's say a few years ago, is China. But what makes China specific? Well, they had a very long-term focused strategy of building. They had the accumulation of resources. They had a very strong financing from the state. And of course, if you have focus towards implementation with this facility of gathering loads of capital and assets, as well as long-term strategy, then of course it's easier. Now, can we have the same in the European Union? As you have mentioned, we have 27 member states, and as we have seen also from the State of Digital Decade program, there is still a huge divergence between the level of digitalization and advancement of individual member countries. So the big difference between China and the EU is that in China you have less friction points, less scope for veto that we do have in the EU. So building a digital infrastructure that is more independent, I think requires addressing those friction points and vetoes, trying to decrease them, and thinking not about how to build European solutions across all the levels, but how to build solutions that the EU can integrate within this stack, so that taking into account existing interdependencies, not only between the layers, but also between the countries that build this infrastructure, how can we have also a leverage, and how we can try to achieve an endpoint where the key countries involved in building will have kind of more symmetrical leverages over each other.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that comparison with China is really thought-provoking. And to me, the key question that doesn't get asked enough in that context is really what this whole discourse around digital sovereignty and its instantiation in the Eurostack initiative, what is it actually for? And the way in which I would try to reframe that conversation is really to ask the normative orientation question.
What is it
first.
for, including who is it for?
Exactly. So if we touch on those two dimensions, so on the what is it for side, I think what we should ask is what kind of digital future do we want for Europe? And to me, that would entail less benchmarking against the US and China, which doesn't mean we should ignore what is happening there, but it would mean to really try to imagine what an European alternative could look like. So instead of just talking about European values, we would need to figure out what would it actually mean to materialize those European values in infrastructures. So in that way, the normative orientation would guide the question of what kind of infrastructures we would need, which would then guide the question of what kind of governance frameworks we would need to get there. And what struck me about the declaration is that if you ask who is it for, it seems to be mostly about governments that assert digital sovereignty and about industry that is going to build digital sovereignty. But as you pointed out in the seminar as well, that leaves out the demos itself, or demo as Calypso would have it. So what about the public? How do we bring the public into that conversation?
Actually, now that you have mentioned the public, I wanted to first mention another thing that really struck me when I was reading the declaration. So the declaration is about sovereignty, and sovereignty is, as you have mentioned, about democracy. But if you look at the bullet points that are discussed, what should be done to achieve that, democracy comes at the very end. So to me, at least my personal reading was that we are trying to kind of bring industry on board. So there are many messages towards the industry, but democracy should not be treated in an instrumental way. It should come first. And I think that, of course, declaration is just an expression of the objectives and ambitions. But let's not forget that if we consider different markets within those different layers of the stack, demand can look very differently. So in some layers, it will be mostly demand coming from the companies, whereas in others, it will be demand coming from the end users and citizens. So we need to have them on board. We need to have a public buy-in of the messages in this document in order to ensure that the building project will actually produce actual benefits to everyone. So that for me means more participatory governance and the inclusion of consumers and explaining to them, because they are used to free products, which we know, of course, they are not free products, because if I use a search engine or email, I do pay with my data. But I think that the value proposition that we should convey to end users is that there is a security aspect, there are other aspects, it's not simply about the price. So we should be willing to pay for the things that we really value. There should be more harmony between what we say we want and what we actually do. And
I think that point that we could imagine a different Europe with different digital infrastructure, in which democracy is not just seen as a hindrance that prevents us from executing the infrastructural strategy that we want to implement, and is not just instrumental in garnering the political support for the digital infrastructure strategy that has been decided elsewhere, but that centers the diverse publics that constitute Europe, and that centers not just what consumers currently demand, but what they could demand going forward, would allow us to maybe imagine a completely different declaration of European digital sovereignty. And I'd love to continue that conversation along those lines. So what alternative declarations can we imagine? And how can we empower all those that were not on the stage in Berlin, but that have already started experimenting with alternative digital infrastructures in this space?
That actually brings me also to another two things. One comment and a question. I think on who actually was on the stage in Berlin, I'm really curious about the professional profiles of those people, because I think that very often people who are involved are economists, lawyers, and political scientists, whereas what struck me in one of the books that I have read, which was Breakneck, about China, industrial policy and development, was that there are many people in the kind of high levels of the Communist Party that are engineers, and engineers have let's build mindset. And I think that the success requires kind of having engineers, economists and lawyers together. But when you talked about democracy and comparison to the US and China, that maybe we should think differently, maybe we could have a different declaration. During your seminar, we have spoken about India. Do you think that there could be anything that we could kind of learn from them in order to draw some different lessons for ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's not just in this geopolitical constellation, but also because that's where exciting ideas are coming from. I think India, Brazil, Japan, Australia, those are jurisdictions that are too often overlooked in this discourse. And what you said about the importance of engineers really resonated with me, and I think it's also a key institutional question for this place, for the SDG and for the EY as a whole. So how can we become a place where we assert the value of the social sciences and humanities, but also bring in those that actually build and might have a different way of thinking about building? So I think that's what we should be doing going forward, and that's how we should continue this conversation.
I'm on the same page with you on that and looking forward to it.